Marcus Johnson walked through the front doors of Lincoln Elementary School with his backpack slung over one shoulder. The 8-year-old boy had moved to this new town just 2 weeks ago with his mother, Sarah. His father worked overseas, and they rarely talked about him at home. Sarah had gotten a new job that required them to relocate, and Marcus was still getting used to everything being different. The hallways smelled like floor cleaner and seemed much bigger than his old school. Other kids rushed past him, chatting with friends they had known for years. Marcus felt invisible as he made his way to his new third-grade classroom. He had always been a quiet child, preferring to observe before jumping into new situations. His mother had taught him to be respectful and work hard no matter what challenges came his way. When Marcus entered room 15B, he noticed most of the other children were already seated. The classroom had colorful posters on the walls and plants by the windows. 24 small desks were arranged in neat rows, and Marcus spotted an empty one near the back corner. He walked over and sat down, placing his new notebook and pencils on the desk surface. Mrs. Henderson stood at the front of the room, writing math problems on the whiteboard. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her clothes looked expensive, and she wore glasses that she frequently pushed up her nose. When she turned around to face the class, her eyes immediately found Marcus. "Class, we have a new student joining us today," Mrs. Henderson announced. Her voice was sharp and carried easily across the room. "This is Marcus Johnson. I expect everyone to make him feel welcome." The other students turned to look at Marcus, and he felt his cheeks grow warm. Some kids smiled and waved, while others just stared curiously. Marcus raised his hand slightly and said hello in a soft voice. Mrs. Henderson nodded once and continued with the morning lesson. As the day progressed, Marcus noticed that Mrs. Henderson treated him differently than the other students. When he raised his hand to answer a question about the story they had read, she looked right past him and called on someone else. During math time, she walked around the room checking everyone's work, but she skipped his desk entirely. When it was time for lunch, she reminded the class about proper behavior in the cafeteria, then looked directly at Marcus and said, "Some children need extra reminding about how to act appropriately in school." Marcus felt confused and hurt by her comment. He had always been well-behaved at his previous school. His teachers there had praised him for being polite and hard-working. He wondered if he had done something wrong without realizing it. During lunch, he sat alone at a table near the window and ate his sandwich quietly while watching the other kids play outside. The afternoon brought art class, which Marcus had been looking forward to. He loved drawing and had brought his own set of colored pencils from home. The assignment was to draw a picture of their family. Marcus carefully sketched his mother and himself, then added his father in his military uniform, even though he had not seen him in months. When Mrs. Henderson walked by his desk, she stopped and examined his drawing. "This is very creative, Marcus," she said loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "Though I wonder if this is really your family or just wishful thinking." Several children looked over with curious expressions, and Marcus felt embarrassed without understanding why. After art class, Mrs. Henderson assigned reading homework for the weekend. She handed out permission slips for an upcoming field trip to the Science Museum. When she reached Marcus's desk, she placed the papers down and said, "Make sure your mother understands that this trip requires proper supervision. Some families need more guidance than others." Marcus carefully put the papers in his folder, feeling more confused than before. He had noticed that Mrs. Henderson spoke to him differently than she spoke to his classmates. Her tone was often colder, and she seemed to assume he would cause problems before he even had a chance to prove himself. He wondered if all teachers in this new school were like this or if it was just her. When the final bell rang, Marcus packed his belongings slowly. He watched as other children rushed out to meet their parents or catch the bus. His mother would not be there to pick him up for another hour because she had to work late. The school had an aftercare program where students could wait safely until their parents arrived. Mrs. Henderson was erasing the whiteboard when she noticed Marcus still at his desk. "Is someone coming to get you?" she asked with a slight frown. "I hope you're not planning to wander around the building unsupervised." "My mom enrolled me in aftercare," Marcus replied politely. "She'll pick me up at 5 o'clock. Mrs. Henderson made a disapproving sound with her tongue. "I see. Well, make sure you follow all the rules in aftercare. The supervisors there don't have time to deal with children who can't behave properly." She gathered her purse and jacket, then left the classroom without saying goodbye. Marcus walked slowly to the aftercare room, thinking about his first day. He missed his old school and his old teacher, Mr. Williams, who had always been kind and encouraging. Mr. Williams had never made him feel like he was different or unwelcome. He had celebrated Marcus's good grades and helped him when he struggled with difficult concepts. In the aftercare room, Marcus found a quiet corner where he could start his homework. The other children were playing games or reading books. A few came over to introduce themselves and ask about his old school. They seemed friendly and normal, which made him feel a little better about this new place. As he worked on his math problems, Marcus thought about what his mother had told him before school started. She had said that sometimes people would judge him unfairly, but that he should always hold his head high and prove them wrong through his actions. She had also said that there were good people everywhere, who would appreciate his kindness and intelligence once they got to know him. Marcus decided he would try his best to be a good student, even if Mrs. Henderson seemed determined not to like him. He would complete all his assignments carefully, follow every rule, and be respectful to everyone he met. Maybe eventually she would see that her first impression had been wrong. He had no idea that his quiet determination would soon lead to events that would change everything at Lincoln Elementary School. The second week at Lincoln Elementary proved even more challenging for Marcus than the first. Mrs. Henderson's treatment of him had grown noticeably worse, and now other students were beginning to notice. During morning announcements, she would often look directly at Marcus when the principal discussed school rules about respect and proper behavior, as if the message was specifically meant for him. On Tuesday morning, Marcus arrived at school 5 minutes early, just as his mother had taught him. He liked to use those extra minutes to organize his desk and prepare for the day. As he was arranging his pencils, Mrs. Henderson walked into the classroom carrying her coffee and a stack of papers. "Marcus Johnson," she said sharply, causing him to look up immediately. "Why are you here so early? Are you having problems at home that require you to come to school before you're supposed to?" Marcus felt his stomach tighten with nervousness. "My mom drops me off on her way to work," he explained quietly. "She said it was okay to come a few minutes early." Mrs. Henderson set her coffee down hard on her desk, making a loud sound that echoed in the quiet classroom. "Well, I don't appreciate having students wandering around my classroom unsupervised. In the future, wait in the hallway until the proper time." Marcus nodded and began putting his supplies back in his backpack. He spent the remaining minutes standing in the empty hallway feeling embarrassed and confused. When other students started arriving, some of them asked why he was standing outside. He did not know what to tell them. During reading time that day, Mrs. Henderson divided the class into groups based on reading levels. She placed Marcus in the lowest group, even though he had been in advanced reading at his previous school. When Marcus politely mentioned this, she responded loudly enough for the entire class to hear. "Marcus, at this school we don't allow students to choose their own groups based on what they think they can do. We place students where they belong based on proper assessment." She handed him a book that was much easier than what he usually read. "I'm sure this will be challenging enough for you." The other students in the advanced reading group looked at Marcus with confusion. Many of them had heard him speak during class discussions and knew he understood complicated ideas. Jenny Martinez, a girl who sat near him, whispered that she thought there had been a mistake. Marcus appreciated her kindness but felt too embarrassed to say anything else. At lunch that day, Marcus sat with Jenny and 2 other students, David and Ashley. They were curious about his old school and asked him about his family. Marcus told them about his mother's new job and mentioned that his father was working overseas. He did not want to go into details about his family situation because it made him feel sad. "Your mom seems really smart," Ashley said after Marcus mentioned that his mother had gone to college. "What kind of work does she do now?" Marcus was about to answer when Mrs. Henderson approached their table. She was supposed to be supervising the entire cafeteria, but she seemed to focus most of her attention on Marcus. "Children, please remember that lunchtime is for eating, not for excessive talking," she announced. Then she looked directly at Marcus and added, "Some students need to learn proper cafeteria behavior. I don't want to hear reports of disturbances from your table." The other children looked puzzled because their conversation had been quiet and polite. After Mrs. Henderson walked away, David shook his head in confusion. "We weren't being loud or anything," he said. "I don't understand why she said that." Marcus felt his appetite disappear. He wrapped up his sandwich and spent the rest of lunch period in silence, while his new friends tried to cheer him up. They could see that Mrs. Henderson's comments were hurting his feelings, even though he had done nothing wrong. The afternoon brought science class, which Marcus loved. They were learning about the solar system, and he had read several books about planets and stars. When Mrs. Henderson asked the class to name the planets in order from the sun, Marcus raised his hand eagerly. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, he said correctly when she called on him. Instead of praising his right answer, Mrs. Henderson frowned. That's correct, but in the future, please don't show off by reciting information you've memorized. Real learning comes from understanding concepts, not just repeating facts. Marcus felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. He had not been trying to show off at all. He genuinely loved learning about space and had answered the question because he was excited to participate. Several other students had given the same answer throughout the week, and Mrs. Henderson had praised them for being smart and well-prepared. After school, Marcus waited in the aftercare room for his mother to pick him up. He tried to focus on his homework, but his mind kept wandering back to the events of the day. He was beginning to understand that Mrs. Henderson had decided not to like him for reasons he could not figure out. This realization made him feel lonely and frustrated. When his mother, Sarah, arrived at 5 o'clock, she could immediately tell something was wrong. Marcus was usually cheerful and eager to share stories about his day. Tonight he walked silently to the car and buckled his seatbelt without saying a word. "How was school today, sweetheart?" Sarah asked as they drove home through the quiet residential streets. Marcus stared out the window at the houses and trees passing by. "It was okay," he said softly, but his voice lacked its usual energy. Sarah glanced at her son through the rear-view mirror. She had noticed that he seemed less happy since starting at this new school, but she had hoped he just needed more time to adjust. As a single mother trying to balance a demanding new job with raising her child, she sometimes worried that she was not paying enough attention to his needs. "Did anything special happen today?" she asked, trying to encourage him to open up. Marcus wanted to tell his mother about Mrs. Henderson's treatment, but he did not want to worry her. He knew she was working hard at her new job and dealing with stress about their recent move. He also worried that if he complained about his teacher, his mother might think he was not trying hard enough to fit in at the new school. "We learned about planets in science class," he said finally. "That was interesting." Sarah smiled in the mirror. "You've always loved space and astronomy. Maybe we can go to the planetarium this weekend if I can get some time off work." Marcus nodded and managed a small smile. He decided he would try even harder tomorrow to be the kind of student Mrs. Henderson wanted him to be. Maybe if he was extra quiet and extra careful, she would start treating him more fairly. He had no way of knowing that his teacher's behavior had nothing to do with anything he had done wrong, and everything to do with her own prejudices and assumptions about who he was. By the third week of school, Mrs. Henderson's discriminatory treatment of Marcus had become impossible to ignore. Other students were starting to whisper among themselves about how unfairly their teacher treated the new boy. Even some of the parents who volunteered in the classroom began to notice the stark difference in how she spoke to Marcus compared to the other children. On Wednesday morning, the class was working on a creative writing assignment about their favorite family traditions. Marcus wrote carefully about how his mother made special pancakes every Sunday morning and how they would read books together before bedtime. His handwriting was neat, and his story included vivid details and proper grammar. He felt proud of his work and hoped Mrs. Henderson would finally see that he was a capable student. When Mrs. Henderson collected the papers, she barely glanced at Marcus's story before placing it at the bottom of the stack. She spent several minutes reading and praising other students' work, commenting on their creativity and writing skills. When she reached Marcus's paper during the grading session, she held it up and addressed the entire class. "This is an example of writing that tries too hard to impress," she announced. "Simple, honest writing is much better than showing off with fancy words and complicated sentences." She handed the paper back to Marcus with a C+ grade. While students with similar or even simpler stories had received A's and B's, Marcus stared at his paper in disbelief. He had not used any fancy words or complicated sentences. His story was straightforward and honest, exactly what the assignment had requested. He felt tears forming in his eyes but blinked them back, determined not to cry in front of the class. Jenny Martinez, who sat nearby, looked at Marcus's paper and then at her own. She could clearly see that his writing was better than hers, yet she had received an A. During math class that afternoon, Mrs. Henderson announced a timed multiplication test. Marcus had always been good at math and felt confident as he worked through the problems. He finished with several minutes to spare and double-checked his answers carefully. When time was called, he was certain he had done well. The next day, Mrs. Henderson returned the graded tests. Marcus received his paper with a disappointed frown from his teacher. He had gotten a 78%, with several problems marked wrong even though he was sure his answers were correct. During recess, he asked Jenny to look at his test. She quickly noticed that Mrs. Henderson had marked 7x8 or 56 as incorrect, even though the answer was right. "This is definitely right," Jenny said, looking confused. "My older sister taught me this multiplication table last year. 56 is the correct answer." David and Ashley gathered around to look at the test. They found 3 other problems that were marked wrong despite having correct answers. When they compared Marcus's test to their own, they realized that Mrs. Henderson had marked identical correct answers as wrong, only on Marcus's paper. "You should tell your mom about this," Ashley suggested. "This isn't fair at all." Marcus felt torn about what to do. He knew his friends were right, but he worried about causing trouble. His mother had taught him to respect his teachers and work through problems politely. He decided to approach Mrs. Henderson directly and ask her to look at his test again. After lunch, Marcus stayed behind as the other students went to recess. He approached Mrs. Henderson's desk nervously, holding his math test. "Mrs. Henderson," he said politely, "I think there might be some mistakes on my test. Could you please look at it again?" Mrs. Henderson looked up from her computer with an annoyed expression. "Mistakes? Are you suggesting that I don't know how to grade a simple multiplication test?" "No, ma'am," Marcus replied quickly. "I just think maybe some of my answers got marked wrong accidentally. Like this one where 7 times 8 equals 56. Mrs. Henderson took the paper and glanced at it briefly. "Marcus, I don't appreciate students questioning my grading. If you spent more time studying and less time making excuses, perhaps your grades would improve. This conversation is over." Marcus felt his stomach drop with disappointment. He had approached his teacher respectfully and had been right about the errors, but she refused to even consider that she might have made a mistake. He walked to recess with his head down, feeling more discouraged than ever. Outside on the playground, his friends immediately noticed his sad expression. When he told them what had happened, they became angry on his behalf. Jenny suggested they should all go to the principal together, but Marcus was afraid that would make things worse with Mrs. Henderson. Unknown to Marcus and his friends, their conversation was overheard by Ms. Rodriguez, the school librarian, who was supervising recess that day. She had been working at Lincoln Elementary for 15 years and had never seen a teacher treat a student the way Mrs. Henderson was treating Marcus. She had also heard other teachers talking quietly about their concerns regarding Mrs. Henderson's classroom management. That afternoon, during the final hour of school, Mrs. Henderson assigned students to clean up different areas of the classroom. She gave Marcus the job of emptying all the trash cans and wiping down the bathroom sinks, while other students were asked to do simpler tasks like organizing books or cleaning the whiteboard. "Marcus needs to learn the value of hard work," she announced to the class. "Some children require more responsibility to develop proper character." As Marcus carried the heavy trash bags to the dumpster outside, he noticed that the school principal, Dr. Williams, was walking across the parking lot toward the building. Dr. Williams was a tall, professional-looking man who always dressed in nice suits and seemed kind when he spoke during morning announcements. Marcus had never spoken to him personally, but he had heard other students say that Dr. Williams was fair and cared about all the children in his school. Marcus continued with his assigned task, not knowing that Dr. Williams had noticed him struggling with the heavy trash bags while other students his age were doing much lighter work inside. The principal made a mental note to ask Mrs. Henderson about her classroom job assignments, as it seemed unusual for such a young child to be handling all the heavy cleaning duties alone. When Marcus's mother picked him up that evening, she noticed that his school clothes were dirty and he seemed exhausted. She asked him about his day, but once again, Marcus did not want to worry her with his problems. He simply said that school was fine and that he had helped clean the classroom. Sarah Johnson looked at her son carefully. She was beginning to suspect that something was wrong at school, but Marcus seemed reluctant to talk about it. She decided she would pay closer attention to his homework and maybe schedule a conference with his teacher to discuss how he was adjusting to the new school. She had no idea that her quiet, well-behaved son was being systematically targeted by a teacher who had made unfair assumptions about him from the very first day. The situation in Mrs. Henderson's classroom reached a breaking point during the 4th week of school. What started as subtle discrimination had evolved into blatant unfairness that even the youngest students could recognize. Marcus tried harder than ever to be the perfect student, but nothing he did seemed to satisfy his teacher's growing hostility toward him. On Thursday morning, the class was preparing for their weekly spelling test. Marcus had studied diligently the night before, practicing each word multiple times with his mother. He felt confident about the 20 words they had been assigned to learn. As Mrs. Henderson began calling out the words, Marcus wrote each one carefully in his neatest handwriting. "Number 15, Mrs. Henderson announced. Neighborhood. The children played in their neighborhood. Marcus wrote the word correctly and moved on to the final 5 words. When the test was finished, he reviewed his answers and felt satisfied that he had done well. However, when Mrs. Henderson returned the test the following day, Marcus stared at his paper in shock. He had received a 60% with 8 words marked as incorrect. Looking more closely at his paper, Marcus realized that Mrs. Henderson had marked several words wrong that he knew he had spelled correctly. The word neighborhood was marked with a red X, even though every letter was in the right place. The word wonderful was also marked wrong, though Marcus had spelled it perfectly. During lunch, Marcus showed his test to his friends, who had become his strongest supporters in dealing with Mrs. Henderson's unfair treatment. Jenny examined the paper carefully and compared it to her own test. "This is definitely spelled right," she said, pointing to the word neighborhood. "Look, I spelled it exactly the same way and got it marked correct." David nodded in agreement. "This is getting really bad, Marcus. She's not even trying to hide it anymore." Ashley looked around the cafeteria to make sure no teachers were listening. "My mom is a teacher at another school. She says this kind of thing isn't normal. Teachers aren't supposed to treat students differently because of how they look or where they come from." Marcus felt a chill run through him as he realized what Ashley was suggesting. He had wondered why Mrs. Henderson seemed to dislike him so much, but he had never considered that it might be related to his race. The thought made him feel sick to his stomach and even more confused than before. That afternoon, during art class, the students were working on a project about community helpers. Marcus chose to draw a picture of his mother in her professional clothes, since she had recently started working in the school district's administrative office. He worked carefully on the details, trying to capture his mother's kind smile and professional appearance. When Mrs. Henderson stopped by his desk to observe his work, she made a comment loud enough for nearby students to hear. "That's very imaginative, Marcus. Though I hope you understand the difference between fantasy and reality when it comes to career goals." Marcus looked up at his teacher with confusion. "This is my mom," he said quietly. "She works in an office downtown." Mrs. Henderson gave him a condescending smile. "Of course, dear. It's wonderful to have dreams and aspirations. Just remember to stay focused on realistic goals that match your circumstances." The other students exchanged uncomfortable glances. They could tell that Mrs. Henderson was being mean to Marcus, even if they did not fully understand why. Jenny raised her hand and said, "Mrs. Henderson, Marcus told us his mom has an important job. Why wouldn't that be realistic?" Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened. "Jenny, please focus on your own artwork. Marcus needs to learn that success comes from hard work, not from making up stories about his family background." Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. He was not making up anything about his mother. Sarah Johnson had worked incredibly hard to get her college degree and land her current position. She had taught Marcus to be proud of her accomplishments and to believe that he could achieve anything through dedication and effort. After school, Marcus waited in the aftercare room as usual. He tried to concentrate on his homework, but his mind kept replaying Mrs. Henderson's hurtful comments. He was beginning to understand that his teacher had decided he was a certain type of person based on assumptions that had nothing to do with who he really was. Ms. Rodriguez, the librarian who had been observing the situation, approached Marcus while he was working on his math homework. She had noticed that he often seemed sad during aftercare, and she wanted to make sure he felt supported at school. "How are things going in your new classroom, Marcus?" she asked gently, sitting down beside him at the small table. Marcus looked up at the kind librarian. He had always felt comfortable in the library, where Ms. Rodriguez treated all students with respect and encouragement. For the first time since starting at Lincoln Elementary, he felt like he could speak honestly about his experiences. "It's hard," he admitted quietly. "I try to do good work, but Mrs. Henderson doesn't seem to like me very much." Ms. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. She had heard similar concerns from other staff members and had witnessed some troubling interactions herself. "Can you tell me more about what's been happening?" Marcus hesitated, then began describing some of the incidents that had occurred over the past few weeks. He told Ms. Rodriguez about the unfair grading, the inappropriate comments, and the way Mrs. Henderson seemed to assume the worst about him and his family. As he spoke, he felt a mixture of relief and worry about whether he was doing the right thing by talking about his teacher. Ms. Rodriguez listened carefully without interrupting. As an experienced educator, she recognized the signs of discriminatory treatment immediately. She had seen similar situations before, though rarely so blatant. Her heart went out to Marcus, who was clearly a bright, well-behaved child who deserved so much better than what he was experiencing. "Marcus," she said gently, "you've done nothing wrong by telling me about this. Every student deserves to be treated fairly and with respect. I want you to know that there are adults in this school who care about you and want to help." Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes, but this time they were tears of relief rather than frustration. For weeks he had felt alone and confused by his teacher's treatment. Now finally an adult was listening to him and taking his concerns seriously. "What should I do?" he asked Ms. Rodriguez. "Keep being the wonderful student you are," she replied. "Continue working hard and treating others with kindness. And remember that Mrs. Henderson's behavior says nothing about you and everything about her own problems." As Marcus packed up his homework and waited for his mother to arrive, he felt a small spark of hope for the first time in weeks. He did not know that Ms. Rodriguez was already planning to document what he had told her and bring her concerns to the attention of the school principal. Change was coming to Lincoln Elementary, though it would happen in ways that no one could have predicted. The following Monday brought a series of events that would finally expose the truth about what had been happening in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. Unknown to Marcus, several concerned adults at Lincoln Elementary had been quietly documenting the troubling behavior they had witnessed. Ms. Rodriguez had spoken confidentially with other teachers, and a pattern of discrimination was becoming impossible to ignore. That morning, Dr. Williams, the school principal, decided to make an unannounced observation of Mrs. Henderson's third-grade class. He had received subtle but consistent reports from various staff members about concerning classroom management practices, and he wanted to see the situation firsthand. He positioned himself quietly near the back corner of the room where he could observe without disrupting the lesson. Mrs. Henderson was in the middle of a reading comprehension exercise when Dr. Williams entered. She noticed him immediately but continued with her lesson, perhaps not realizing how her behavior toward Marcus would appear to an objective observer. The class was discussing a story about friendship and kindness, and several students had raised their hands to share their thoughts. Marcus raised his hand enthusiastically when Mrs. Henderson asked the class to identify the main lesson of the story. He had read ahead the night before and had thoughtful ideas about how the characters learned to accept their differences. However, Mrs. Henderson looked right past him and called on other students instead. "Sarah, what do you think the author was trying to teach us?" Mrs. Henderson asked, completely ignoring Marcus's raised hand. After Sarah answered, Marcus kept his hand up, hoping for a chance to contribute. Mrs. Henderson called on 3 more students while Marcus waited patiently. Finally, when no other students had their hands raised, she looked at Marcus with obvious reluctance. "Yes, Marcus, what is it?" she said in a tone that suggested he was interrupting rather than participating. "I think the story shows that people can be friends, even when they're different from each other," Marcus said thoughtfully, like how the characters learned that their different backgrounds made their friendship stronger. It was an insightful response that showed Marcus had truly understood the story's message. However, Mrs. Henderson responded with a dismissive comment that made Dr. Williams lean forward with concern. "That's a very simple interpretation, Marcus. Perhaps you should try to think more deeply about what you read instead of just repeating obvious points." Dr. Williams frowned as he watched this interaction. He had been observing classrooms for over 20 years, and Marcus's answer had actually been quite sophisticated for a third-grade student. The way Mrs. Henderson had dismissed his contribution while praising much simpler answers from other students was clearly problematic. The situation became even more troubling during the next part of the lesson. Mrs. Henderson assigned the class to work in pairs on a worksheet about the story. As students began choosing partners, she made a point of intervening when it came to Marcus. "Marcus, you'll work with Tommy," she announced, assigning him to pair with a student who had been absent for most of the previous week and had not read the story. "Tommy needs extra help catching up, and I'm sure you can learn from working with someone who has different strengths." Dr. Williams watched as Marcus accepted this assignment without complaint, even though it meant he would spend most of the work time helping his partner understand the story, rather than engaging with more challenging aspects of the assignment. Meanwhile, other students were allowed to choose their own partners and work at their appropriate level. As the morning progressed, Dr. Williams observed several more incidents that confirmed his growing concerns. When Marcus asked to use the restroom, Mrs. Henderson questioned whether he really needed to go and reminded him about appropriate timing for such requests. When another student made the same request 10 minutes later, she granted permission immediately without any questions. During math time, Dr. Williams noticed that Marcus was working from a different textbook than his classmates. When he quietly asked Mrs. Henderson about this, she explained that Marcus needed additional support with basic concepts. However, Dr. Williams could see that Marcus was completing his problems quickly and accurately, suggesting he was actually working below his ability level. The most concerning incident occurred just before lunch. The class was cleaning up their desks when Mrs. Henderson announced the weekly classroom job assignments. While other students received roles like line leader, paper monitor, or plant caretaker, Marcus was assigned to empty trash cans and clean the sink area. Marcus has shown that he benefits from responsibilities that teach the value of hard work, Mrs. Henderson explained to the class. These tasks will help him develop important life skills. Dr. Williams felt his jaw tighten with anger as he realized what he was witnessing. The pattern was unmistakable. Marcus was being systematically treated differently than his classmates, held to different standards, and given different opportunities based on discriminatory assumptions about his background and abilities. After the students left for lunch, Dr. Williams approached Mrs. Henderson at her desk. His expression was serious but controlled as he asked to speak with her privately. "Mrs. Henderson, I have some concerns about the classroom dynamics I observed this morning," he began carefully. "Specifically, I noticed some inconsistencies in how you interact with different students." Mrs. Henderson straightened in her chair, sensing criticism. "I pride myself on treating all students fairly. Dr. Williams, if you have specific concerns, I'd appreciate you being direct about them." "I noticed that Marcus Johnson seemed to be held to different standards than his classmates," Dr. Williams replied. "His academic work appears to be at or above grade level, yet he's placed in lower-level materials. His classroom contributions are dismissed, while similar comments from other students are praised." "Can you help me understand your reasoning?" Mrs. Henderson's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her defensive posture. "Marcus requires a different approach than some of our other students. Based on my professional experience, I believe in setting appropriate expectations and providing structure that matches each child's background and capabilities." Dr. Williams studied his teacher carefully. Her language was coded, but her meaning was clear to someone trained in recognizing discriminatory practices. She was making assumptions about Marcus based on his race and her preconceptions about his family situation, rather than evaluating him as an individual student. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to be conducting more frequent classroom observations over the next few weeks," Dr. Williams said firmly. "I want to ensure that all our students are receiving equitable treatment and appropriate academic challenges. I'll also be reviewing student work samples and assessment data to better understand how we can support every child's success." As Dr. Williams left the classroom, he was already planning his next steps. He needed to document what he had observed, review Marcus's academic records, and possibly speak with the child's mother about her son's school experience. Most importantly, he needed to ensure that Marcus was protected from further discrimination while he developed an appropriate response to this troubling situation. Mrs. Henderson watched the principal leave with growing unease. For the first time since Marcus had arrived in her classroom, she began to worry that her treatment of him might have consequences she had not anticipated. Dr. Williams spent the rest of that day reviewing Marcus Johnson's enrollment records and academic history. What he discovered only deepened his concern about the situation in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. Marcus's previous school records showed consistently high grades, glowing teacher comments, and test scores that placed him well above grade level in both reading and mathematics. The disconnect between his documented abilities and his current classroom experience was stark and troubling. The principal also took time to speak privately with other staff members who had interacted with Marcus. Ms. Rodriguez shared her observations from the library and aftercare program, painting a picture of a bright, respectful child who was clearly struggling with something at school. The art teacher mentioned that Marcus often seemed withdrawn during creative activities, which was unusual for a child his age. Even the cafeteria staff had noticed that he frequently sat alone and seemed sad during lunch periods. That evening, Dr. Williams made a decision that would change everything. He called Sarah Johnson and requested a meeting to discuss Marcus's adjustment to Lincoln Elementary. He was careful not to reveal the full scope of his concerns over the phone, but he wanted to hear the mother's perspective on how her son was experiencing his new school. Sarah agreed to meet the following afternoon during her lunch break. She had been growing increasingly worried about Marcus, who had become quiet and withdrawn at home. His usual enthusiasm for school and learning had disappeared, replaced by reluctance to discuss his day or engage with his homework. She hoped the principal could provide insight into what was troubling her son. Meanwhile, Mrs. Henderson was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with Dr. Williams's newfound interest in her classroom. She had always prided herself on running a tight ship and maintaining high standards, but now she worried that her methods were being misunderstood. She decided to modify her approach with Marcus, at least temporarily, to avoid further scrutiny. On Tuesday morning, Mrs. Henderson made a noticeable effort to treat Marcus more fairly. She called on him during discussions, praised one of his assignments, and gave him a normal classroom job like the other students. Marcus was surprised by the change but cautiously hopeful that things might finally be improving. However, the damage had already been done. Marcus's confidence had been shaken by weeks of unfair treatment, and he found it difficult to trust that this change would last. During reading time, when Mrs. Henderson asked him to read aloud, his voice was quiet and hesitant, very different from the confident student he had been at his previous school. Jenny Martinez, who had become Marcus's closest friend, noticed the change in their teacher's behavior as well. During recess, she and the other children discussed what they thought might be happening. Maybe someone told her she was being mean to Marcus, Ashley suggested as they sat on the swings. "I hope so," David replied. "My dad always says that bullies only stop when someone makes them stop." Marcus listened to his friends but remained cautious. He had learned not to get his hopes up too quickly when it came to Mrs. Henderson's treatment of him. He focused on his schoolwork and tried to stay positive, not knowing that significant changes were already in motion behind the scenes. That afternoon, Sarah Johnson arrived at Lincoln Elementary for her meeting with Dr. Williams. She had taken time off work and was dressed professionally, looking every bit the accomplished woman she was. Dr. Williams greeted her warmly in his office and offered her a seat at the small conference table where they could talk privately. "Thank you for making time to meet with me, Mrs. Johnson," Dr. Williams began. "I wanted to discuss how Marcus is adjusting to our school and see if you have any concerns about his experience here." Sarah chose her words carefully. "Marcus seems less happy than he was at his previous school. He's always been enthusiastic about learning, but lately he seems reluctant to talk about his day or engage with his homework. I'm wondering if he's having trouble making friends or keeping up with the academic expectations." Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Can you tell me about Marcus's academic performance at his previous school? I'd like to understand his capabilities and interests better." Sarah's face lit up as she talked about her son's achievements. She described his advanced reading level, his love of mathematics and science, and the way his previous teachers had praised his creativity and critical thinking skills. She showed Dr. Williams samples of Marcus's recent work from home, including a detailed report he had written about the solar system and a short story he had created about friendship. As Dr. Williams examined the work samples, he felt his anger toward Mrs. Henderson intensify. The quality of Marcus's independent work was clearly at or above grade level, yet he was being treated as a struggling student who needed remedial support. The discrepancy was not just unfair, it was educationally harmful. "Mrs. Johnson," Dr. Williams said carefully, "I want you to know that Marcus is a wonderful addition to our school community. He's polite, hardworking, and clearly very bright. However, I have some concerns about his classroom experience that I think we need to address." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with worry. What kind of concerns? Dr. Williams explained what he had observed during his classroom visit, being careful to focus on specific behaviors and incidents rather than making accusations about Mrs. Henderson's motivations. He described the inconsistent grading, the inappropriate academic placement, and the different standards Marcus was being held to compared to his classmates. As Dr. Williams spoke, Sarah felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and relief. She was angry that her son had been treated unfairly, sad that he had been suffering in silence, and relieved that someone in authority had finally recognized what was happening. "I've been wondering why Marcus seemed so different lately," Sarah said quietly. "He's always been confident and eager to participate in class discussions, but recently he barely wants to talk about school at all." Dr. Williams leaned forward with compassion. "Mrs. Johnson, I want you to know that this situation is not acceptable, and we're going to take immediate steps to address it. Marcus deserves to be in a classroom environment where his abilities are recognized and nurtured, where he's treated with the same respect and given the same opportunities as every other student." Sarah nodded, feeling grateful that her son's principal was taking the situation seriously. "What happens next?" Dr. Williams outlined his plan for addressing the immediate classroom situation and ensuring Marcus's academic and emotional needs were properly supported. He also mentioned that there might be broader administrative actions required, though he could not discuss all the details at this point. As their meeting concluded, Sarah felt hopeful for the first time in weeks. She looked forward to telling Marcus that his principal cared about his success and was working to make things better. Neither she nor Dr. Williams could have predicted the shocking revelation that was about to transform the entire situation at Lincoln Elementary School. The next morning brought an unexpected turn of events that would forever change the dynamics at Lincoln Elementary School. Dr. Williams had planned to begin formal proceedings regarding Mrs. Henderson's discriminatory behavior, but fate intervened in a way that no one could have anticipated. Marcus arrived at school that Wednesday morning, feeling slightly more optimistic than he had in weeks. His mother had explained that Dr. Williams cared about his success and was working to improve his school experience, though she had been careful not to share all the details of their conversation. For the first time since starting at Lincoln Elementary, Marcus felt like he had an adult advocate who understood his situation. During morning announcements, Dr. Williams's voice came over the intercom with a special message for the entire school. "Teachers and students, I have some exciting news to share. We will be having a special visitor today who will be observing classes and meeting with some of our families. I want everyone to remember our school values of respect, kindness, and inclusion as we welcome our guest." Mrs. Henderson listened to the announcement with growing nervousness. She had been trying to modify her behavior toward Marcus since Dr. Williams's observation, but she worried about what other scrutiny might be coming her way. She decided to be especially careful to treat all her students fairly, at least while any visitors were present. At 10 o'clock that morning, there was a soft knock on the classroom door. Dr. Williams entered, followed by a tall, distinguished man in a military uniform. The visitor had kind eyes and a warm smile, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to leadership and responsibility. "Students," Dr. Williams announced, "I'd like you to meet Colonel Johnson. He's visiting our school today to learn about our programs and meet some of our families." Marcus looked up from his math worksheet and felt his heart skip a beat. The man standing at the front of his classroom looked remarkably familiar, though Marcus could not immediately place where he might have seen him before. There was something about the visitor's smile and the way he carried himself that seemed oddly comforting. Colonel Johnson's eyes swept across the classroom, taking in the colorful displays and the eager faces of the third-grade students. When his gaze reached Marcus, he paused for just a moment and a subtle smile crossed his face. Marcus felt a strange flutter in his stomach, as if something important was about to happen. "Colonel Johnson has been serving our country overseas," Dr. Williams continued, "and he's recently returned to spend time with his family here in our community. He's interested in learning about how we support all of our students and ensure that every child feels valued and successful. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward to greet the visitor, her professional demeanor masking her internal anxiety. "Welcome to our classroom, Colonel Johnson. We're honored to have you here. Our students have been working very hard on their academic skills and character development." Colonel Johnson nodded politely but seemed more interested in observing the students than engaging in conversation with Mrs. Henderson. His eyes returned frequently to Marcus, who was trying to focus on his math problems while stealing glances at the mysterious visitor. "Dr. Williams," Colonel Johnson said in a clear, authoritative voice, "would it be possible for me to speak with some of the students about their experiences here? I'm particularly interested in hearing from children who might be adjusting to new situations or changes in their lives." Dr. Williams nodded immediately. "Of course. Mrs. Henderson, could you select a few students who might be good representatives of our school community?" Mrs. Henderson felt trapped by the request. She wanted to choose students who would reflect well on her teaching, but she also sensed that this visitor was paying particular attention to Marcus. Reluctantly, she selected 3 students for the conversation, including Marcus as the third choice after 2 of her most well-behaved pupils. Colonel Johnson asked the selected students to join him at a small table near the windows. As they gathered around him, Marcus felt increasingly certain that he recognized something familiar about this man, though he could not identify what it was. "Tell me about your school," Colonel Johnson began, addressing all 3 students. "What do you like best about learning here?" The first 2 students gave enthusiastic responses about their favorite subjects and activities. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he hesitated for a moment, unsure of how honest he should be in front of his teacher. "I like science class and reading," Marcus said carefully, "and I've made some good friends here." Colonel Johnson studied Marcus's face with growing interest. "That's wonderful. And how are your teachers helping you learn and grow?" Marcus glanced nervously at Mrs. Henderson, who was watching the conversation intently from across the room. He wanted to be truthful, but he also did not want to cause trouble. "Most of the teachers are very nice," Marcus replied diplomatically. "They work hard to help all the students." Colonel Johnson seemed to sense the diplomatic nature of Marcus's response. He leaned forward slightly and spoke in a gentler tone. "Sometimes when we're adjusting to new places, we face challenges that test our character. How do you handle difficult situations, son?" The word son hung in the air with unexpected weight. Marcus felt his breath catch as something clicked in his mind. The familiar smile, the kind eyes, the way this man carried himself. Suddenly, Marcus realized why Colonel Johnson seemed so familiar. "Dad?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Colonel Johnson's professional composure cracked slightly as a wide smile spread across his face. "Hello, Marcus. I've missed you so much." The classroom fell completely silent as everyone processed what had just happened. Mrs. Henderson stood frozen in shock, her face draining of color as the implications of the situation became clear. Dr. Williams watched with a mixture of surprise and understanding as pieces of a puzzle suddenly fell into place. Marcus jumped up from his chair and ran to his father, who caught him in a tight embrace. Tears of joy streamed down both their faces as they held each other for the first time in months. The other students watched with amazement as their quiet classmate was reunited with his father, whom they now realized was the distinguished military officer visiting their school. "I wanted to surprise you," Colonel Johnson said softly to his son. "I've been working with Dr. Williams to plan this visit so I could see how you're doing at your new school and spend some time with you and your mother." Mrs. Henderson felt the room spinning around her as she realized the full scope of her mistake. The child she had been systematically discriminating against, the student she had dismissed and demeaned, was the son of a respected military officer who was clearly accomplished and well-connected. Her assumptions about Marcus's family background had been completely wrong, and now her unprofessional behavior was exposed in the most humiliating way possible. Dr. Williams stepped forward with a knowing expression. He had suspected there was more to Marcus's family story than he had initially understood, and Colonel Johnson's surprise visit was providing the final piece of information he needed to address the situation in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. As Marcus and his father continued their emotional reunion, the truth about the discrimination that had been occurring became undeniable to everyone present. The contrast between Mrs. Henderson's treatment of Marcus and the obvious pride and accomplishment of his family created a moment of reckoning that would change everything at Lincoln Elementary School. The racist teacher's shocking actions had finally been exposed, and justice for Marcus was about to begin.